If there's one thing that lots of Republicans agree on with the Democrats is the need for criminal justice reform. I mean, of the 18 people running for president in 2016 on the Republican side, 16 of them supported something called criminal justice reform. Translation, there are too many black people are being stopped too often, arrested too often, tried too often, convicted too often, sent to prison too often for too long a time, and once they're back out on the street, they're sent back to the prison too often. That's criminal justice reform. We have to figure out a way to straighten those numbers out. Because the numbers as they appear now, they appear to show that black criminality is wildly out of proportion. That can't be right, because if that's right, that means reporters and public officials are in denial, deceit, and delusion about it because they just simply won't tell us that. What they tell us is this crime is all the result of teens and unfairness and white racism over and over and over. That's part of the greatest lie of our generation, the hoax of black victimization. That's what we've documented here on my YouTube channels and in my books, especially Don't Make the Black Kids Angry. So anyway, big story out today about criminal justice reform, how it's working. This comes from the new website called I think it's called Axios by the big Washington insider Mike Allen, whose family members actually watch this channel, by the way. Anyway. Headline, incarceration of white Americans on the rise. There's still a significant disparity in U.S. jails and prisons, but since 2005, the jail incarceration rate for African Americans has declined by 20% nationally and 30% in urban areas. And the incarceration rates for whites has slowly increased. And then they show you a chart where it shows that the white people in prison is going up, or the white people in the prison is going up and the black people in prisons is going down. Proof positive that criminal justice reform works, people. Yeah, well, these numbers, the numbers. We got big chap. We spent a lot of time and Don't Make the Black Kids Angry talking about the numbers, how the cops fudge the numbers through witness intimidation, through stitches for snitches, through breaking the cradle to prison pipeline. Lots and lots of stories about lots and lots of places where the numbers are just totally understated the real amount of black criminality in a city, whether that's in Los Angeles or Milwaukee or New York. Tons of those stories. And nobody was really connecting the dots until we did. But I'll tell you another person who, well, that might not be correct, because Chicago Magazine did a great story on this, which we spread around as well, where they were talking about how the cops in Chicago are just constantly pushing down the numbers. So if you ask any public official in Chicago, they will tell you the numbers have gone off the cliff, down. But then you go through Chicago neighborhoods one after another, and you see people look into the camera and say, boy, we've never seen anything like this around here before. And in this Chicago Magazine article, they talked about how, as we have written about as well, we're talking to cops, they talked about how they fudge the numbers, how certain crimes get downgraded from, say, an assault to offensive touching or something like that, because the word has come out from the top. Too many black people in jail, no reason whatsoever. We have to de-escalate these things. Translation, quit arresting black people, damn it. Every cop in America knows what this is about. So does every teacher, because they're facing the same pressures in their classrooms. And now we see teachers saying the same thing. More and more teachers unions around the country are saying for the first time, we don't have any control in our schools. Our school is just like one big prison of anarchy. We can't expel them. We can't suspend them because that'll mess up our numbers. And there's no learning. It's a dangerous place. It's dangerous for students. It's dangerous for teachers. And more teachers are coming out and say, yeah, for the first time, this is really happening. But if you listen to school officials, they give these grateful reporters some numbers, and they go, "Oh yes, our arrests are down 72% in the last 5 years." Yes, that's simply because you're not arresting students who are guilty of some very nasty business in your schools. I mean, and don't make the black kids angry. We talked about a cop from Chicago, a captain. I think you could also find this in the Second City Cop blog up there. He went to a community meeting, this captain. He started the meeting off by putting his hands in the air and go, "Listen, we're not even going to talk about the numbers. We're not going to talk about the statistics because we all know none of them are worth anything. They're worthless for giving us an indication of what's up, what's down, what's really happening." That's how polluted the numbers are. We get so many stories from cops, so many inside stories from cops, lots and lots of stories from Chicago cops. This came from a New York cop. He posted it on my minds.com channel. "Colin, I've never discussed this before, but here it goes. While working for the New York Police Department, I personally observed thousands of crimes that were downgraded or outright scanned. Outright shit-canned. In the Manhattan precincts, thousands of grand larcenies were turned into lost property complaints. How could that happen? You have to understand that the NYPD is really only concerned with the reportable felonies sent to the FBI for the Uniform Crime Reports, (felony index crimes). By hook or crook, they are recategorized, downgraded, or disappeared. We had a lieutenant whose major function was re-interviewing the Manhattan tourists who were victims of grand larcenies, pickpockets, lush workers, etc. After confirming they were tourists and heading back home, the incidents became lost property non-crimes over and over again. This is from a retired New York cop. Felony assaults are reportable to the FBI. No one cares about misdemeanor assaults. While on the desk in Manhattan, a mom called and said she had additional info about the perps who beat up her son. No detectives were available. I pulled the report. I could not believe what I saw or heard. Her son had been brutally beaten by a mob of school kids. He suffered a broken jaw, a separated shoulder, and was thrown onto the subway train tracks. Amazingly, this was classified as a misdemeanor. To the FBI and New York Police Department brass, it's like it never happened. They were lying with statistics. I want to add, the vast majority of NYPD cops I observed were professional and honorable. A good percentage of those involved or responsible for crime stats did everything in their power to game the system. Law enforcement has lost its way. Transparency, truth, honor, and justice are the only path. I fear we have become lost. Good night, Colin. That's how you get the numbers down. That's criminal justice reform. They brag about that in New York. When Mayor de Blasio was sworn in, I think it was 5 years ago, he had Harry Belafonte, who's down with the cause as much as anybody in America. He got up and he blasted his predecessor for trying to arrest their way out of this mess, for arresting too many black people, damn it. And that's going to change under de Blasio. A couple of days later in the New York Times, the guy who worked for Bloomberg, who was in charge of the numbers, he got up and said, "Hey, what are you talking about? We've been arresting 30 or 40% fewer people every year for the last couple of years." It's like a bidding contest, like who can get their numbers down the most, no matter what happens on the street. They play that game in Baltimore all the time. At least they tried to for a long time, when finally it got to the point where the mayor had to look into the camera and said, "Yes, crime in our city is under control." All that happened while the numbers were going down. Behind this black criminality and public officials and reporters who are so eager, so willing to deny, condone, excuse, encourage, and even lie about it, underneath of that, it's very easy to find an enormous level of black on white hostility. Forget the violence and the crime. Before the violence and the crime, there is hostility. It's easy to find. It's easy to find MSNBC, CNN, and it's just right there in plain sight. But for a lot of people, it's like, well, that's just a thing now. Black people are allowed to get on television and joyfully wait for the day when they'll be in control. White people are out. This demographic landslide they keep talking about. These are the same people who never got past third grade math. All of a sudden, they're experts on demography. Okay, whatever. Whatever you think about the demographics, to me, the interesting part is the joy that so many black people, so many black leaders take in the fact that there's black people they say black population's growing at a faster rate than the white population. And that day will be a day of reckoning. I mean, we see this all the time. And what about, if you really want to see black on white hostility expressed in a mainstream fashion, you don't have to go any further than the Root or the Griot. Now, the Root used to be owned by Washington Post. It was started by Skip Gates. Remember Skip? Professor Henry Gates. He's the guy going on PBS to remind Ben Affleck that his slaves were a bunch of ancestors. He's the guy from the beer summit. People saw him coming home from a trip. The cops went up to him and said, "Excuse me, sir, do you have any ID?" He threw a big shit fit, part of my bad language. And he was defiant toward the cops. And then when Obama went off script and he said, "That was dumb. The cops, hassling Skip Gates. How could you do that, man?" So Skip started, the Root. NBC had a similar one called the Griot. Anyway, so the Root was sold to Univision a couple of years ago. So now the Root is just one of many, many websites, news websites, mixed in with lots and lots of Hispanic TV stations and radio stations, but they thought they'd give the fellas their own little place. And you got to watch two things here. You got to watch A, what's going on in this story and what it means, but B, then we're going to tell you the most surprising thing of all. Who paid for it? Spoiler alert. You did. Anyway, so the story headline, the headline's dated, I think it's today. Cry me a river of white tears, white South African colonizers. This article is just totally scorning a recent trip that Laura Southern took to South Africa, produced a short documentary on it. Things that we talk about here once in a while. I think that Ilana Mercer has been all over with her great book, Into the Cannibal's Pot. And Ken Brakey in his book, Never, Never, Never Again. The great thing about Ilana's book is she reminded us of the importance of South Africa to us. The importance of South Africa is not that there's a lot of injustice down there and we have to do something about it. No, it's a big world and we can't solve every injustice on the planet. And if I had my way, we'd back up, 1,000 cruise liners and get all these persecuted white people out of South Africa because every one of them is doomed on one level or another. But the big message of South Africa is the world has turned its back on the genocide, white genocide happening in South Africa. How white people are being harassed, tortured, robbed, beaten, murdered on epic levels all over the country. The world has turned its back on that because the world thinks that whatever happens to white people in South Africa, they deserve it. So let's listen to this report from America, from an American black site about their attitude towards white people in South Africa. And I will tell you, if you want to, go compare it to all the other stories in the Root and the Griot. You will see there's not a dime bit of difference in attitude. It's like, whatever happens to white people, they deserve it. And I remember when Thomas Sowell wrote a big column about me, a guy in Philadelphia. He's a Philadelphia judge. I forget his name. He writes a blog called The Field Negro. and Negro. And so Sowell wrote this big column saying Colin documenting this and that and this and that. And, he did 3 of them within a month. And it was like, wow, that's fantastic. That'll change your life, by the way. But anyway, this guy writes in his blog, it's like, look, no matter what happened to black people, no matter what black people do to white people, they deserve it. That's a judge saying that. Now we've got this supposedly mainstream outlet that used to be owned by the Washington Post. Listen to the scorn. Listen to the venom dripping off of this article. So they're talking about Laura Southern, talking about the documentary she did. And in a 7-minute documentary, the tone-deaf alt-right propagandist ruminates on the travails of white South Africans who are, quote, going through an intense crisis, unquote, complete with sad music in the background. In the very same country where their people colonized native South Africans into a brutal racial caste system beginning in the 1940s. Southern said the whites are being displaced and they have to live in settlement camps, and there's lots and lots and lots of bad business going on down there. The root doesn't care. It's beyond not caring. They do care. They are taking absolute joy in the incredible hardship and death that is being visited upon white people in South Africa, because now it is their turn. So they continue the article by listing lots of the things happening there, and then they say very flippantly, "You don't say." The crazier part is how many South Africans and white Europeans were in shrill agony saying what is happening to these deserving whites is the worst thing since the Syrians bombed their own people, whatever that means. They also said what was happening was a rape culture. They didn't like that. And of course, then the magazine further heaps scorn on the idea that this is reverse racism or white lives matter. This one commentator named Bayarina Human, she wrote White Lives Matter. Then somebody else came in and said as a comment, "I think I'll go make myself a ham sandwich." A lot of people love that comment. Of course, this response is labeled inhumane, said the magazine. Okay, here comes the money graph. The question is, have these people no sense of history, context, or irony? Maybe white poverty is increasing because they actually have to compete with black people for jobs. Maybe they don't work hard enough. Maybe they're just dumb and lazy. I don't know. What's really glaring, this is from the black people at the root. What's really glaring is the sense of entitlement that white Americans and white South Africans both have. What do they have in common? Wealth? Check. Highest rates of incarceration and HIV? Check. A once legal but still pervasive racial caste system which gifts and curses whites into thinking they are so much of a god that the world owes them something? Check. Here's an idea for these poor, sad white South Africans. Get a job, work harder, do better, don't rely on the government so much, stop having kids, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, go back to your own country. The gall of these people is truly amazing. That was an unbelievably popular article because it really represented a very popular but often unspoken viewpoint that white people deserve it. And I really liked the way she lumped in the white people in America with the white people in South Africa as the same, because when the same thing happens, and it's happening more and more often, when the same kind of crime victimization happens to white people here, that's what we hear. White people deserve it. White people have been messing with us for 4,000, 4 million, 40 million years. Whatever happens to them, they deserve it. When the demographic shift changes, if it ever does change, when it changes, well, then we're going to really see who gets what they deserves. Here's another cutout. I think this is from the Griot, but it's from one of the mainstream black magazines. One of the writers is talking about white people and their fear of black people. This fear is why they're so obsessed with arming themselves with multiple human-killing machines. It's why they fight against even the notion of incremental disarmament so vehemently. They are scared shitless of us, or anyone who is not them. And this fear is why our shitty gun laws exist, and while they will continue to exist. Perhaps this fear is guilt-based. And they're scared the same way you were as a kid when you stole some cash from your teacher's purse and you kept waiting for repercussions, but they just never came. Isn't that weird? I don't know anybody who ever stole any cash from their teacher's purse. I know, it's really weird, isn't it? I don't know anybody who did that. But I do know if you listen to the black magazines, the black websites, the black podcasts, the black radio shows, the amount of racial hatred that drips off these shows, you could float an ocean liner on it. So how do these places stay in business? Who pays for this crazy stuff? Do advertisers really say, hey, I want to be in front of a bunch of black people who hate white people because, man, I know they're going to be great consumers. I know they're going to want to buy my product. And I know I want to go around bragging about them when they buy my product. Well, no. I'm looking at an ad right now from the Griot, which is published by Univision. It's an ad in Spanish. El mañana puede traer cualquier cosa. Así que nos preparamos para todo. It's an ad in Spanish for the U.S. Army. The federal government is one of the largest advertisers in the world. So who's paying for that piece of crap you just listened to, full of anti-white venom? You are. Congratulations.
State corrections officials have said the murder of an Ohio State student was an outlier, a rare occurrence of the system not working.
10 investigators found that is not the case. There were other victims besides Reagan Tokes, highlighting a long-standing failure in the system.
Our chief investigative reporter, Bennett Haverly, joins us now with an investigation he has been working on for months. Bennett.
Scott and Tracy, the case of Reagan Tokes was not a one-off. We found them. Offenders who are, after being released from prison, went on to commit additional acts of violence, all while under state supervision. What's more, we found the state may have ignored its own policies, raising more questions about if these deaths could have been prevented.
She was left in a field naked and shot twice in the head on a bitterly cold night. And she laid there for 12 hours before somebody found her frozen, lifeless body.
Lisa and Toby Tokes say their daughter's murder was preventable.
Please don't allow the cycle to continue.
Lisa is trying to convince state lawmakers that change is needed, that the state failed to closely watch Brian Goldsby, the man charged with her daughter's murder, the man who's pleaded not guilty to the crime.
He should have never been out on the streets, and he especially should not have been out there unmonitored.
Questions have been raised about the level of supervision Goldsby received. During his recent prison term for robbery and attempted rape, he acquired 52 infractions and was transferred several times. But current Ohio law prevented him from being given additional time for bad behavior. So when he got out, no halfway house would take him, so he was assigned a GPS ankle monitor. But no one tracked him or that GPS data closely, even though the Tokes believe alarm bells should have been going off. Parole records show Goldsby sometimes failed to charge the device's battery and faced little discipline. He also went missing from the exit program that eventually housed him, but again, faced little sanction. It was only after his arrest for Reagan's murder that police checked the data on that ankle monitor. And what they found, police say, ties Goldsby to a string of robberies in the German Village area in the weeks and even the day leading up to Reagan's disappearance. What's more, police say that data places Goldsby in the park where Reagan's body was found. Then there was this. An internal Columbus police email uncovered by 10 Investigates shows the department may have had its own doubts about the effectiveness of the ankle monitor. It states, quote, Goldsby had an ankle monitor on when we arrested him, and they just got the GPS locations downloaded off it, and he was at each of the robberies. Seems those monitors are quite the deterrent.
I seriously can't even believe this is what is in place in the state of Ohio, especially being that it's 2017.
There were no guardrails restricting Goldsby's movements, no inclusion or exclusion zones that would have restricted where he could or could not go. And that appears to violate the state's own policy. This 2016 policy from the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction states that the Adult Parole Authority shall submit an initial schedule with at least the first week of monitoring to include any curfews, inclusion zones, and exclusion zones. But that did not happen with Brian Goldsby because he was released homeless.
Our daughter lost her life over this flawed system. This is our reality that will never go away, change, or get better for us. How many others were there before her?
There were others. Other victims, other cases all over the state that illustrate a failure to watch some of the most violent offenders.
There's obviously no supervision at all.
Rhonda Blankenship is one of those other victims. She survived an armed robbery in December of 2013 at this home in Barberton, Ohio. She is the only survivor. Her boyfriend, Johnny Kohler, and his 2 children, Ashley and David, were shot dead. Court records state 2 men, Eric Hendon and his younger brother, Michael, came into the home looking for money and drugs.
Pretty much witnessed him shooting Johnny, shooting Ashley, and shooting David. That was horrible. And then them coming back at me, that was even scarier, looking down a barrel of a gun.
Rhonda lost her eye. A bullet, she says, is still with her, just like those vivid memories.
It all happened in 6 minutes, and it seemed like it took forever. It was like a lifetime.
6 minutes?
Mm-hmm. And come to find out, he was wearing a GPS tracker.
That's right. Eric Hendon, the man later convicted of killing her boyfriend and his children, was under the watch of the state when police say he committed the crime. After serving 12 and a half years in prison for attempted murder for placing a gun inside a woman and pulling the trigger, Hendon was assigned an ankle monitor through the Oriana halfway house in the Akron area. Authorities were able to use GPS technology to pinpoint Eric Hendon to this house on the night of the murders. The problem was, it was after the fact.
If more would have been done, I think that he wouldn't have had the opportunity to do what he did.
We found other issues that raised questions about the level of supervision in the state, including 1,375 ex-offenders who have violated their parole and are considered to be at large, meaning the state of Ohio has no idea where they are. Some might say it's a broken system.
Yes. And the system needs to be worked on.
Years ago, Christy Owens dated this man, Billy D. Anderson. She characterized it as a normal relationship, until she says it wasn't. It turned violent.
He never raped me, but he beat me, put his hands on me. You know, he wouldn't let me leave. That's scary.
The last straw court records show was a 2012 incident that involved Christy being held against her will at a Columbus hotel room. That landed Billy in state prison. During his prison term, 10 investigators found Anderson acquired more than 80 sanctions for acting out, including disobeying orders. He was also accused by guards and other inmates of acting out sexually.
To me, the state is not really doing their job.
Anderson was released after 3.5 years, but records show he failed to show up to his halfway house. Instead, police say he went to this downtown Chase bank, where he raped an employee near the vault. He's currently back in prison serving 40 years after being convicted in that case.
Why would you let somebody that had a history of violence and do this, let him out free, and then trust him that he's gonna go somewhere? That's crazy.
Anthony Caldwell's with the union that represents state parole officers. He says the questions we've raised point to long-standing issues.
This happens more often than we care to admit, where violent offenders are in our community, they're not properly monitored, and then they reoffend in violent and horrific ways.
In fact, we found the state has known about other problems, specifically that many halfway houses won't accept sex offenders, which often leads to many of them being released from prison homeless. This 2006 document by the Correctional Institution Inspection Committee shows that hard-to-place offenders have the greatest need for secure, structured, and supervised placements on return to the community, and that this has been a long-term issue of concern that remains current. That was more than 10 years ago. This year, the state spent $67 million on halfway houses.
Why wasn't somebody screaming from the rooftops, we have to fix this now? Why wasn't your union? Why weren't the parole officers? Why weren't your voices louder?
I mean, for the last decade, we have been working with DRC and raising this issue all the time, saying that we need more manageable caseloads.
According to ODRC figures, there are 453 parole officers to cover 38,000 ex-inmates under state supervision.
This is a failure of the overall system.
For months, we tried to get answers from DRC Director Gary Moore. We called, we emailed. All additional requests were declined. Then in late September, Director Moore called us.
So I guess the key question is, why hasn't more been done before this?
The conversation, he said, could not be used for broadcast, which is why we're not airing his response. But we still wanted to question him directly, so we found him the next day at an event in Akron.
Hey, Director Moore?
Yes.
Hi, Bennett Haberle with 10 TV.
Yes.
Okay. Hey, I was hoping I could ask you a few follow-up questions from our conversation.
I'm focused on this. We're not going to talk about this, but let's be focused on this event today.
Well, I would say, just took a moment. The Tokes family had said that her death was preventable. We had talked about hard-to-place offenders. You guys have known about for years. Is there anything your agency could have done?
Listen, we're going to focus on getting things better for a lot of people today. Thank you.
You can't answer a question, sir?
That's it. We're done.
The state's refusal to answer still leaves questions about why so many voices were silent for so long.
And this is the way it has been for years. And nothing has been done about it until now.
And we'd like, again, to extend the invite to the state to actually sit down and talk with us and answer our questions. Meanwhile, change is on the horizon, or at least change hopes to be on the horizon. The Reagan Tokes Act, the bill that's currently moving through the State House, would drastically change how prisoners are sentenced, allowing them to be given more time if they misbehave behind bars. It also calls for hiring more parole officers and beefing up how many of these offenders are watched. Coming up tonight at 11, we do know one subject ODRC is watching: us. See the visual evidence and the communication that ODRC is having about 10 Investigates.
Well, Bennett, we know you and our entire 10 Investigates team will continue this investigation.
We will.
Thank you.
Yes.
You can watch all of Bennett's investigations about violent offenders right now. We have them for you online at 10tv.com/10investigates.
And we're going to continue to follow developments in Reagan Tokes' murder and her family's quest to change the criminal justice system through the Reagan Tokes Act.
But all is fair in love and war and criminal justice reform, right? As long as we perpetuate the greatest hoax of our generation, the myth of black victimization, everything is okay. But it's very rare that we hear of somebody who comes out, goes in one end and comes out the other end of this criminal justice reform. That's what we had here in Columbus, Ohio. This guy got put in prison, had received a ridiculously light sentence, and when he got to prison, he did these ridiculously bad things, many of them, but they had to kick him loose anyway. And when they did, he wasn't out of prison for more than a day or two before every safeguard they said it was in place on him just totally failed, was totally ignored. And they said, oh yeah, well, that's a one-off. Then this newspaper, this TV station in Columbus, to their eternal credit, got in there and said, A, this is an abomination what happened to this girl, and B, it's happening all the time. Criminal justice reform. That woman's name is Reagan Tokes. She would be alive today, but for the insistence of lots of people who don't know anything about anything, pretending they know something about criminality, pretending they know that black people are in jail only because of white racism, totally ignoring this epic difference between black people and white people and Asian people on criminality, totally ignoring it. I don't care what the reasons are. It's real. And now we have Axios coming out and going, oh yeah, it's not, it's real, but we're correcting it. Don't worry. A lot more white people are staying in prison. A lot more black people are getting out. Where do we celebrate? Hey, should we invite Reagan Tokes to the celebration? Wow, Now, where do we get these fools from? Where do we get these fools who insist on imposing these ridiculous levels of criminal justice reform on us while they're living in some, crazy condo 40 stories above the planet with complete security that it would, take about 27 legions of Roman soldiers to break through. That's criminal justice reform. That's how it's tied to what black on white hostility. That's what we see every day in the newspapers, the TVs, magazines, the radio, the websites. And every day, reporters and public officials continue to be in ignorance, denial, and deceit and delusion about it. That's the cost. Did you hear anybody in Columbus, Ohio, where this happened to Reagan, Tokes? Did you hear any black people crying any crocodile tears over what happened to her? Anybody standing up and saying, yeah, maybe we should take another look at this criminal justice reform where we're giving black people lighter sentences and we're letting them out sooner. Maybe we should take a look at that. No, because people in Columbus, Ohio know that on some level, Reagan Tokes deserved what she got because she might not have been a racist, she might not have been a segregationist, but she was a beneficiary of 4 million years of white on black hostility and mistreatment. So whatever happens to her, well, hey, tough luck, better luck in your next lifetime. And maybe when you come back, you'll have figured out the most important lesson you apparently didn't learn in this life, neither did your parents. Don't make the black kids angry.